Psycho is often considered to be one of Hitchcock's greatest films. His clever manipulation of the audience and his complete disregard for many of the conventions that made up the audience's expectations made it his biggest box office hit. But there's one scene which critics really didn't like.
His mother was a clinging, demanding woman. And for years, the two of them lived as if there was no one else in the world. Then she met a man.
The psychiatrist scene towards the end of Psycho is described by film critic Pauline Kael as arguably Hitchcock's worst scene. Hitchcock began his career in the era of silent movies, so he developed a visual language which allowed him to say with images what others could only say with dialogue. But this scene doesn't really follow that style. The tone feels too expository in contrast with everything that Hitchcock has shown us so far. It seems to almost underestimate the intelligence of the viewer. The psychiatrist is a dominant representation of the intellectual figure who explains the details and motivations of the villain at the end of a 1960s detective film. He exudes pretentiousness and everything becomes logical and rational as the narrative dives back into the realm of the clinical. The mid-shots, along with the typical shot-reverse shot pattern, make the scene feel fairly uniform. It blends in with the genre shift which took place earlier from slasher film to noir detective. Perhaps this scene is Hitchcock's way of poking fun at the simple explanations that society projects on psychotic behaviour. We see the shift back to normalcy on the scale of abnormality, and the scene allows the audience to catch their breath. However, the cultural context at the time is the main reason for the insertion of the psychiatrist scene. 1960s audiences were relatively unfamiliar with psychology, and therefore screenwriter Joseph Stefano worried that Norman Bates may have been incorrectly thought to be a homosexual or a transvestite. Hitchcock makes a point of expelling any misconceptions by having the psychiatrist correct the police officers.
He's a transvestite. Not exactly.
This is why an explanation of Norman's character was required, to ensure that the naivety of the audience at the time did not interfere with the plot. To 1960s audiences, this would have felt like a fairly uniform ending to a Hollywood film. All is good in the universe of Norman Bates. But then, Hitchcock throws us a curveball.
He feels a little chill. Can I bring him this blanket?
Sure. All right.
The camera dollies forward as it follows a police officer towards Norman's cell. It pauses outside the door and we hear the mother's voice.
Thank you.
And then we enter the room and we immediately notice several things about the mise-en-scène. Knowing Hitchcock, nothing in the frame is accidental. Perhaps this room represents Norman's mind. The figure who sits on the left power line of the frame isn't technically Norman, it's Mother. The room is mainly empty, signifying how Mother is the main focus of Norman's thoughts. The barred window might represent how Norman is trapped, both in the physical sense and in his own head. The blanket that is draped around Norman is typically associated with comfort, which might suggest that Mother is Norman's safe zone. Then we get the music. Throughout Psycho, Hitchcock has repeatedly used music to hint at the psychotic state of a main character, and this scene is no exception. Bernard Herrmann's score uses slow strains of the violin, and strings sound uncertain yet still eerie. The camera zooms in from a wide shot to a medium close-up of Norman. It is a long, unbroken shot, and because the audience is not familiar with this type of shot, the scene becomes even creepier. The non-diegetic voiceover of Mother's thoughts is synced with Norman's facial expressions, and the shot of the fly crawling across Norman's hand.
Probably watching me. Well, let them. Let them see what kind of a person I am. I'm not even going to swat that fly.
The voice confirms that we are now in Norman's mind, and we are forced to see the world through the villain's eyes, which is completely unsettling. The camera then cuts back to a close-up of Norman's face, where he directly addresses the camera for the first time in the film. Hitchcock utilizes the greatest effect of breaking the fourth wall in this scene, as there is nothing scarier than first feeling safe and removed from the villain in a movie, and then having that villain look directly at you. The final genre of Psycho comes into play here when you realize that despite all the psychological explanation which we heard in the previous scene, it is still not enough to make us feel secure and safe. The ending becomes the ultimate film noir idea. We are haunted by the unexplainable and the unknown. The locus of horror has shifted from being fantastical to being human. Psycho has helped to reveal that the most horrific thing is the human mind. Within the past 3 minutes, Hitchcock has offered us both sense and nonsense, and he has abandoned the typical Hollywood ending. He encouraged filmmakers to see audiences fair game rather than detached observers. If this final shot of Norman looks familiar, that's because it is. The shot directly mirrors a shot of Marion from earlier in the film when she is processing her crime in her head. By drawing this parallel between Norman and Marion, you realize that both characters felt trapped by figures of authority. In Marion's case, this is her boss, and in Norman's case, this figure is his mother. Using the bird motif, Hitchcock reveals the predator and prey relationship between both main characters, and perhaps the male-female relationship as a whole. It now becomes fitting that Hitchcock's next film was The Birds. Finally, there is a crossfade from Norman's face to the car being pulled out of the swamp. The ghostly image of Mother's skull is superimposed over Norman's face, confirming that the mother side of Norman has taken over. The film seems to be over, but then we get one final shot of the car being pulled out of the swamp. On a surface level, it shows that order has been re-established. However, beneath the surface, we know that order does not help things that much. Marion is still dead, and the police can't undo the damage that Norman has done. The final ominous sound of Bernard Herrmann's score does not imply a happy resolution, but rather makes us anxious at what might emerge from the depths next.